Have you ever seen someone judged by their appearance, only to silence an entire room with a single gesture? Comment: not everything is as it seems. The mansion's foyer smelled of aged wood and refined lavender, but beneath that scent there was a kind of silence that wasn't peace, it was power. The kind of silence only the wealthy can impose, made of long glances, measured steps, and doors that close slowly, as if even the wind feared to disturb. It was in this setting that Helena, the matriarch of a family that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, descended the staircase with the controlled slowness of someone who has time on their side. Her hair was tied in a perfect bun, and her dark wooden cane was more an ornament than a support. She didn't walk, she glided like a decree. On the other side of the house, between the pantry and the laundry, Samuel was carefully folding the napkins his mother, Donna Elisa, had ironed. He did this every day after school, not because he had to, but because he had learned early on that helping in silence was the only way to be noticed without being a bother. He was 12, his voice in transition, and his gaze always seemed to observe more than it should. He didn't talk much, but he listened to everything. The muffled arguments upstairs, Helena's curt orders, the cruel jokes of her grandchildren, and the sound of chess pieces being moved in the front room. It was a sound he knew well. On afternoons when his mother worked late, he would sit by the storage room and leaf through an old chess book he'd found in the school's trash. He learned by playing against himself, against the mirror, against time. He invented opponents, jotted down moves, dreamed of endgames where he defeated kings with weakened rooks, but in that house he was just the maid's son. Until that grey Saturday, as he passed through the entrance of the living room carrying a tea tray, he heard Helena's firm voice calling, "Boy, come here a moment." He stopped, heart racing. She didn't call him by name. She never had. "Have you ever played chess?" she asked, with a faint smirk of disdain. He nodded, almost fearing it was a trap. "Do you know how to play? Or do you think you know?" she teased. "I think I know," he replied, with the calculated humility of someone who'd learned not to show too much too soon. "Well then, come. Let's see if it's true." Helena gestured to the armchair across from her, beside the inlaid chessboard she always kept set up, even when she played with no one. For her, chess was a symbol of elegance, strategy, and control, everything she believed she mastered perfectly. The butler, standing in a corner, nearly dropped his tray as Samuel approached. This wasn't usual, this was almost subversive. Samuel sat with his back straight and eyes fixed on the board. The pieces gleamed under the light of the golden lamp, each with its distinct shape, as if they had personalities. He touched a pawn delicately and opened the game with e4. Helena smiled, a smile of someone who'd seen that move dozens of times. She played her response with the confidence of someone who believes they know the outcome from the first move. The initial moves were slow, as if both were feeling out the terrain. But soon Helena noticed something. The boy didn't just know the moves, he anticipated. His eyes didn't dart nervously across the board like a beginner's. They danced, analyzing, predicting, waiting, and above all, he didn't speak. He played in silence, a silence that seemed to grow and envelop the entire room. Helena began to feel uneasy, not because she was losing. She wasn't yet, but because she didn't understand. Who had taught him this? How could he have such insight? She tested him with a sly en passant, a lateral trap she often used to confound casual opponents. Samuel not only escaped, but used the opening to launch a double attack. Her expression hardened. "You have talent. Curious, very curious," she said, trying to sound casual. "Did your father teach you? Or some little phone game?" Samuel just shook his head. "I learned on my own," he murmured. And there was something she couldn't accept. The idea that raw talent could emerge from nowhere, without pedigree, without tradition, without permission. By the third game, the atmosphere had shifted. Helena had requested that no one interrupt them. The butler kept his distance but watched with wide eyes. The tension was palpable. The old wall clock seemed to tick more sternly, and even the birds on the balcony seemed to have fallen silent. The entire mansion leaned toward that chessboard. Samuel, now more at ease, took greater risks. His moves were bold yet restrained. He understood the game as one understands life. It's not just about advancing, but knowing when to retreat. And each of his moves seemed a silent response to all the invisible humiliations he had witnessed in that house. Helena, on the other hand, began to feel cornered, and it wasn't just the game. It was the possibility, remote but increasingly real, that she was being outplayed by someone she hadn't even deemed worthy of a name. It shook her sense of the world, her belief in meritocracy, her internal structure. Her hand trembled slightly as she moved her queen. She tried to hide it, but Samuel noticed. And then, in the fourth game, he did something she didn't expect. He sacrificed a rook. A risky, audacious move that required reading 6 or 7 moves ahead. She fell into the trap. When she realized she was in a double check with no escape, Samuel didn't even celebrate. He merely leaned back slightly, eyes still fixed on the board. It was as if he was saying, "This isn't about winning. It's about being seen." Helena sat motionless for long seconds. The clock's ticking seemed louder. The lamp's glow highlighted the sweat on her brow. The silence was almost solid, until she stood slowly, adjusted her earrings and said, "Well done. It seems you really do know how to play." But there was something in her tone. It wasn't just surprise, it was restrained admiration, discomfort, and perhaps the beginning of a silent respect. Samuel remained quiet. He knew the true victory wasn't on the board. It was in that look that finally saw him. From that day on, the name Samuel began to circulate through the house with a different frequency and tone. He was no longer just Elisa's son, or the boy who helps with the napkins. He was now the chess boy. And though no one said it aloud, there was something in the way the butler's eyes followed him, or how Helena's grandchildren avoided him in the hallway that said it all. Something had changed. Yet Helena wasn't ready to accept this change without resistance. The following Sunday, she summoned Samuel for another game, but this time with an audience. She invited 2 of her closest friends, both retired judges, men with slow speech, imposing mustaches and upturned noses, to have tea and casually watch the prodigy boy. She wanted to prove something, perhaps to herself, perhaps to the world she felt comfortable in. That talent alone wasn't enough. It required origin, lineage, polish. Samuel arrived punctually, his hair combed with a bit of water and wearing a clean white shirt borrowed from an older cousin. His shoes were worn, but shone from how much he'd polished them. He entered with firm steps, but no arrogance. Helena greeted him with a curt nod and pointed to the chair across from the chessboard. The 2 judges observed him with the typical expression of someone looking at an unpolished sculpture, curiosity mixed with skepticism. "This is Samuel, the boy who dared to defeat me 3 times in a row," Helena said with an ambiguous tone. The old men smiled, but there was more irony than warmth in the gesture. The game began. This time the atmosphere wasn't one of discovery, but of testing. Samuel knew. He knew it was no longer just a game. It was a minefield. Every move would be judged, every mistake magnified, every success downplayed. And yet he played. He played with the same calm as before, with the same silent insight that made it seem as if he'd seen that board before. Not that exact one, but the concept, the challenge, the provocation. This time, Helena made no obvious mistakes. She was attentive, focused, strategic, but something still undermined her: pride. She wasn't just playing to win, but to reverse the past humiliation. And in doing so, she left gaps. Gaps that Samuel recognized as one who reads between the lines of a text he knows by heart. As the game progressed, the 2 judges murmured to each other. One ventured a comment. "This boy has a nose for it. Seems to see 3 moves ahead." The other nodded. somewhat reluctantly. Helena kept her eyes fixed on the board, but her fingers drummed on the marble table. She could sense it. Once again she was being pushed to her limit. And then, in a subtle move, Samuel captured her queen with a bishop she had overlooked. It was like a whisper within a shout. There was no celebration, just a denser silence, as if the air had paused for a moment. Helena stopped. She blinked slowly, and for the first time she turned to the judges and said, "It seems I underestimated the boy." It was a short sentence, but it carried everything she couldn't admit, that the world she knew was no longer so predictable. Samuel said nothing. He simply moved the next piece. The game wasn't over, but something essential had already been decided. This was no longer a test, it was recognition. After the game, Helena dismissed the judges with restrained elegance and invited Samuel for tea. It was the first time anyone in the house had invited him to sit on the veranda, not in the kitchen. He accepted, though he didn't fully understand what it meant. He sat carefully, observing the details of the china, the flowers, the horizon visible between the veranda's columns. "You have a rare gift, Samuel," she said, serving the tea with steadier hands. "But talents like yours need guidance. Have you ever thought about competing?" He replied with a slight nod. "My mother can't afford it." Helena said nothing for a moment. Then she placed a silver spoon beside his plate and said, as if it were nothing, "Perhaps that will change soon." That night, Samuel returned home with a full mind. It wasn't just the game, it wasn't just the victory, it was what that afternoon represented. A crack opened in a door he'd always believed was locked. He slept little, but dreamed a lot. In the days that followed, Helena began to call him often, sometimes to play, sometimes just to talk. She started lending him books, asking about school, probing his interests. And Samuel, still wary, opened up little by little. He discovered that she too had been a lonely child, raised in silence, pressured to be perfect. Perhaps that was why, seeing his raw talent, something in her stirred. Over time, Helena called an old acquaintance, a retired chess coach, to evaluate him. The man was impressed. He said that in 20 years he hadn't seen anyone with that kind of instinctive reading. He offered to train him, for free if necessary. Helena would cover the travel costs. And as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she simply said, "It's the least I can do." Donna Elisa, Samuel's mother, found it all strange. She was afraid at first, afraid it was fleeting, that her son was being used as a showcase. But when she saw his eyes light up as he spoke of openings, tournaments, strategies, she understood. A new world was opening, and he was ready to step through. The first tournament happened 3 months later. A modest municipal competition in a neighborhood school. The tables were simple, the chairs uncomfortable, the lights too harsh. But Samuel was there, in his old blue jacket and a folder with his notes. Helena couldn't attend. She said she didn't like crowds, but sent a driver with an envelope containing a fountain pen and a note. "Write the ending you want." Samuel won every match. Not easily, but with a serenity that unnerved his opponents. Some boys mocked his quiet demeanor, his patched clothes, but they fell silent one by one as the rounds progressed. In the end, he received a simple acrylic trophy, but he held it as if it were crystal. It was more than a prize. It was proof that his silence had finally been heard. When he returned home, he found his mother in the kitchen, seated, eyes teary, holding a letter. It was an offer from a private school with a full chess scholarship. Helena had made calls. Everything was arranged: transportation, uniform, meals. Samuel would study in a place where he'd finally have room to grow. "Is this for real?" he asked, voice trembling. "It is, and I want you to go. I want the world to see what I've seen in you since you were little," she replied, running her hand through his hair with affection. That night, Samuel sat on the floor of his room, opened his notebook, and wrote on the first page, "Not everything is as it seems." Beside it, he drew a pawn. a pawn that advanced to the end of the board and became a queen. Years later, in an interview with a local newspaper, they asked him what his greatest move had been. He smiled, thought for a few seconds and said, "Accepting that first game in that room." The reporter laughed, thinking it was a metaphor, but for Samuel it wasn't a metaphor at all. It all began there, with a chessboard surrounded by porcelain and prejudice, with a queen moved by pride and a boy who only wanted to be seen. In Helena's house, the chessboard remained set up, but it was never used as often again. She continued living there, surrounded by silence and antique furniture. But something had changed. In the corner of the room, where dusty photos of her grandchildren once stood, there was now a black-and-white picture of Samuel holding a trophy, his eyes shining and his smile restrained. Beside it, a small silver plaque read, "The boy who won without raising his voice." She didn't talk about it with anyone, but every afternoon, as she sipped her tea, she glanced at the photo for a few moments, and sometimes, unnoticed, she smiled faintly. It wasn't a smile of defeat or pride. It was a smile of belated recognition, the kind only the very old or the very wise can offer. Samuel, meanwhile, kept playing, not just on the board. He played with life, with opportunities, with the invisible limits that once surrounded him. And with every move, he carried a certainty. You don't need to shout to change the game. Sometimes it's enough to move a piece with conviction, in silence, and let the world watch. The end.